Phil Town is an investor who had a major influence on my journey with getting started in value investing. He was really the first investor that I came across that took Warren Buffett's core principles and laid them out in a really simple and easy to follow fashion. And although I have sort of graduated upwards in some aspects of valuation and so on from some of Phil Town's methods, I still use his core principles of the 4M checklist, meaning moat, management, and margin of safety whenever I analyze a business. And I still listen to Phil Town's podcasts, for example, every single week. And in the past year or two, Phil Town has actually started a fund, Rule 1 Fund. It now has north of $100 million under management. And there are SEC filings that come out every single quarter for that Rule 1 Fund that allow us to see what Phil Town is investing in. And although they are trickier to find than the average SEC filing, they do contain some extra information versus a 13F like we might get for Buffett or Monish Pabrai or Guy Spear or so on. And that extra information is basically, it not only shows us the stocks that Phil Town has been investing in, it also shows us his cash position, so how much money is he kind of sitting with on the sideline that he could potentially invest if the prices were attractive enough. And it also shows us some of the activity in Phil Town's options portfolio, whether he is buying or writing call options or put options. We can see what companies Phil Town might potentially be interested in adding to his portfolio in the future. So if you enjoy this update of Phil Town's portfolio, which is basically as it stood at the end of March 2022, be sure to hit like and also subscribe so that you can see future content on the channel as soon as it goes live. Now, for this quarter in the Rule 1 Fund portfolio, there is a lot to talk about. Phil Town typically seems to run about a 10-stock portfolio, so it is a reasonably concentrated fund. And historically, he has had a lot of cash on the sidelines, and that continues to be the case in this quarter, as I will get into. But there's been a lot of turnover in the existing positions. So we have about 3 stocks that have been sold completely, we have 1 that's been cut in half, and we have 3 brand new stocks. So lots to talk about in this video. We also have about 6 different option contracts that show up in this recent filing. So I'll also talk about what Phil Town is doing in the options space towards the end of this video. Okay, so let's talk through some of the big positions here in the Rule 1 Fund and some of the things that have changed since the last quarter. Now, let's just start off with Phil Town's cash position, because that continues to be the largest investment in the Rule 1 Fund. The net assets reported for the fund was about $157 million, and of that, we saw about $46.1 million sitting in a money market fund. And if I go through and basically look at the price of each stock that he owns, kind of multiplied by the number of shares that he held, I can estimate the approximate value of each of his stock holdings at the end of the first quarter, and that leaves about $36 million unaccounted for. So although he's got $46 million in a money market fund, I'm sort of estimating that he's probably got an additional sort of $36 million sitting in cash on the sidelines, also ready to go. So if we add those 2 chunks of cash together, we've got about 29% in a money market fund and about 23% of the portfolio in cash. So still approximately 50%, a little over 50% now of the portfolio remains in cash for the Rule 1 Fund. Okay, so let's work through each of the stocks that Phil Town continues to hold in the portfolio, where he has made absolutely no change. The first one is Bank OZK, that remains about an 11.3% position. For the Rule 1 Fund, it's one that he's owned for some time. No change in holding for that one. We also have Sprouts Farmers Market. Sprouts remains a 6.3% position in the portfolio. Again, no change to that one. Huntington Ingalls, which is like a military ship manufacturer, 5.6% position, no change. Armada Hoffler, which is a REIT, real estate investment trust, a 4% position, again no change. Sturm Ruger & Co., a 2.7% position, no change there. And finally, in terms of the stocks that Phil Town is basically not adjusted at all, we have Boeing, which is currently a 2.4% position. So interesting to see those core positions continue to be held by Phil Town and by the Rule 1 Fund. Those are becoming fairly familiar names at this point, which is cool to see him kind of buying and holding for the long term with some of these stocks. And let's keep moving down the list now, because we've got a lot more activity coming up in the next few stocks we're going to talk about, and there are some moves in here that may potentially surprise you. So let's have a look firstly at the 4 positions which Phil Town has either sold completely or trimmed to some extent. Now, the first stock that's been sold out of the portfolio that I'm sure will be surprising to many here is that Phil Town has sold 100% of his Alibaba position. This is off the back of him adding to it last quarter. And again, Alibaba continues to be an extremely controversial stock. After first seeing Charlie Munger purchase it in the Daily Journal Corporation, we saw a lot of other investors follow him in. We've seen some kind of reverse course and get out of that investment now. And we see Phil Town as kind of the latest person to do that. Now, I had heard through the grapevine that we should expect to see that move from Phil Town's portfolio, but it is pretty surprising to see him reverse course on that one nonetheless. So that is the first kind of sale in the Rule 1 Fund portfolio. Next one we have is the Spider Gold ETF. Now, he's sold down that gold ETF 100%. And this is something that I've always sort of viewed, again, as another kind of cash alternative for the Rule 1 Fund. Maybe something that will move along with inflation, perhaps, but I sort of view Phil Town as having an overwhelming preference, a lot like Buffett, for cash-producing assets and for stocks. But I do know that Phil Town's approach to valuation is very conservative. He doesn't want to overpay for businesses. He wants a big margin of safety, and for that reason, I think the gold ETF was probably a place that he was kind of storing cash and sitting it on the sidelines until he found something interesting to invest in. So that has now been sold down 100%, potentially giving Phil Town some more firepower to invest in common stocks. Now, the next one that was sold down is along similar lines, and that is Barrick Gold. Barrick Gold is not a gold ETF, but rather a gold miner. And I think, again, Phil Town probably has a similar logic for investing in Barrick Gold here, where he views it as potentially a bit of an inflation hedge. He wrote about inflation a lot in his annual report for the Rule 1 Fund that came out 3 months ago. But interesting to see that he has cut that position out completely, sold it down 100%. And finally, there is one position which Phil Town has halved, and again, this is along very similar lines to the last 2 I just mentioned, and that is the iShares Silver Trust. He's gone from 100,000 shares in that ETF down to 50,000 shares. Again, I view that as some sort of, cash being freed up to potentially purchase common stocks. So that is all the holds and all the sales for Phil Town, and that leads us to the 3 new stocks that Phil Town has purchased in the Rule 1 Fund. And I think there will be some very recognizable names in here, and some that I was actually not particularly surprised to see. If you listen to Phil Town's podcast, you will have heard him talk about 2 of these 3 companies before, and the third one has actually been in the Rule 1 Fund in some of the very early filings. So let's get the first one out of the way that we have seen before and is maybe a little less exciting to most people, and that is Sanderson Farms. So Sanderson Farms is a chicken farmer, a poultry producer. He's added 42,000 shares to that position, and it represents about 5% of the net asset value of the fund. So interesting to see Phil Town kind of re-enter Sanderson Farms after owning it a while back and exiting out. And we've previously seen a bit of options activity around Sanderson Farms as well. So that has been added to the portfolio. And kind of the first big one, which a lot of people will recognize, is actually Activision Blizzard. So Activision is a brand new position, 97,000 shares, represents 4.9% of the fund. It's one that Phil Town again has talked about on his podcast a little bit. I expect that Phil Town had hoped to buy Activision as a traditional stock investment that he'd like to hold for the long term. But of course, we've had quite a big shift in the way that Activision is now trading. We have this buyout offer from Microsoft at, I believe, $95 per share. We saw Warren Buffett even talk about this kind of merger arbitrage opportunity in the Berkshire Hathaway meeting recently, and we saw Buffett kind of go into that position as well. So interesting to see Phil Town enter Activision. Judging by some of the options activity in the past quarterly filing, I think there's a chance that Phil Town actually got into this one before the buyout was announced, although we don't know that exactly. So again, will be fascinating to kind of follow along with what Phil Town does here. Does he continue to hold it, as I expect Buffett probably will, over the next quarter or 2 or 3 as this buyout potentially goes through, or will he sell it and potentially collect maybe a short-term gain that he might have got on Activision between purchasing it and between the buyout news coming out from Microsoft. And the last brand new stock for the Rule 1 Fund portfolio is in fact Netflix. Again, a stock that may not surprise you too much if you listen a lot to the Invested podcast. We've heard Phil Town talk about Netflix having pricing power. So he clearly likes the business, and he is now the proud owner of about 19,000 shares, and it represents at least March 31st prices about 4.5% of the fund. Now, the price at the end of March for Netflix was about $374 per share. I know that it is significantly lower than that price now. So on those initial kind of share purchases, I think Phil Town is almost certainly down, but it potentially gives them the opportunity to purchase more at potentially more attractive prices. And that leads really nicely into Phil Town's options portfolio, because almost all of the options that were either written or purchased in the Rule 1 Fund portfolio actually relate to Netflix. There are a couple that don't, but the overwhelming majority are Netflix related. So firstly, let's talk about the bulk of the option contracts, which are put options written. Now, if you want to learn more about put options, we recently did a podcast with Matt Peterson, who uses options extensively in a very similar way to what Phil Town does. And basically, writing a put option allows Phil Town to collect a premium from the person purchasing that put option, much like an insurance company would collect a premium when they write you an insurance contract. And basically, these options contracts allows the purchaser to basically sell their shares to Phil Town if the shares go down. It's kind of insurance against the share price going down. And Phil Town collects a premium, some cash up front for taking on this risk, as most people would typically view a put option contract. And Phil Town essentially says, if the stock goes down below a certain price before a certain date, I will buy it from you. And actually, Phil Town is often looking for the price to go down. So, typically if you're an insurance company and you're insuring a car and collecting some premium up front to insure said car, you typically don't want the car to crash, and you don't want to have to, pay out on that insurance because the car's kind of worthless, right? Well, typically these put option contracts are written because Phil Town actually thinks that companies like a Netflix or whatever company he's writing these put option contracts on actually still do have a lot of value, and he really would like to buy them at those lower prices, and he can also collect some of the premium up front to effectively get into Netflix or whatever company it might be at a lower price than he would be able to by just buying it straight up. That's the basic idea. So in terms of the put options, there are 4 different option contracts that showed up in this latest filing. The first one is Sprouts Farmers Market. So Phil Town has written a put option contract on Sprouts with a strike price of $28 per share. I'll put up the Sprouts stock chart here so you can see if it has or hasn't dipped below that $28 strike price yet. And that will expire on the 17th of June 2022. Now, the remainder of these put option contracts, of which there are an additional 3, are all in relation to Netflix, and Netflix stock has gone down through all of these different price targets. So I expect that Phil Town has been put the shares on all 3 of these contracts already. Between making the filing, which shows his holdings at the end of March, and filming this video, I expect Phil Town has been put shares at all 3 of these different prices. So those 3 prices were a $310 strike expiring on the 15th of July, a $280 strike expiring on the 15th of July, and a $350 strike expiring on the 1st of April. So if I were a betting man, which I try to avoid speculation, but if I wanted to speculate on what we might see in Phil Town's next quarterly update, I would be reasonably confident that we will see a whole lot more Netflix in the Rule 1 Fund portfolio. Unless for whatever reason he's getting put the shares and he's selling out of them because he doesn't like the business anymore or something like that, I expect that Netflix position will continue to grow. Now, interestingly, we did actually see one put option contract purchased, which if anyone can explain to me why Phil Town might be doing that in the comments, that would be very useful. But we did also see a put option purchased for Netflix at a $250 strike expiring on the 15th of July 2022. And finally, we did see one call option contract written, so this is kind of the opposite of selling the put option and selling insurance for the price going down like we talked about with the puts. Instead, this is saying if the price goes up to a certain point, you can buy my shares from me. So that company was Boeing. He has a strike price of $200 per share and an expiration date of the 1st of April 2022. So again, I'll put Boeing here so that you can see whether or not it did in fact go through that $200 strike before the 1st of April. If it did, Philtown would have been forced to sell his shares, but he would have collected some premium, which is great. And if it didn't go through that price, again, Philtown would have still collected some premium and he would still continue to hold his Boeing shares. So that is the update for the Rule 1 fund portfolio and some of the activity that Philtown has had in the last quarter. So some changes that will potentially surprise some people, like the sale of Alibaba, and maybe some changes that will not surprise people so much if you follow Philtown very closely, like his purchase of Activision or his purchase of Netflix. Now, if you want to see future portfolio updates from Philtown's Rule 1 fund, as well as a range of other super investors, be sure to hit like on the video and also subscribe to the channel so that you can see that content. But that's it from me for this one, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.